So I'd like to once again thank everybody for joining us for this June meeting of the Calgary Police Commission. I'm Benita Croft, as I think you all know. I'm chair of the commission, and I will be chairing this meeting and walking you through our Zoom meeting for today. I would like to start, as usual, by asking everybody to please mute your line while you are not speaking. Being in a record-setting heat wave, I hope we can all hang in there and stay cool. I will do my best to keep us on track, if not ahead of schedule. We have many important things to discuss at our meeting today, but I also know that during this heat wave, a lot of people, especially if they don't have air conditioning, may not find it the most comfortable venue to sit through for a lengthy period of time. I will also, and I welcome reminders of this from my fellow commissioners, try to give a couple of breaks in between for a couple of minutes so people can rehydrate, etc. Before going any further, I would like to acknowledge that this call is taking place on the traditional territory of the Niitsitapi, made up of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the ERA Nakota First Nations, comprised of the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation. These are the people who made treaty with the Crown, forming Treaty 7 territory. The city of Calgary is also homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I know that I speak for all of us on the Calgary Police Commission when I say that we condemn anti-Black racism and prejudice in all forms. We stand in solidarity with our Black, Indigenous, and people of color colleagues, families, and citizens. I would also now like to take a pause to acknowledge the profound grief that is sweeping our nation following the discovery of hundreds of children buried at residential school sites. Like so many, our hearts are heavy, and I know everyone on this call shares that sentiment. We on the Commission offer our unwavering support and will continue to look to Indigenous leaders as we find a way to honor the lives of these children. This is not just a painful history, but a present and lasting trauma. Please join me in a moment of silence for the victims, their families, and communities. Thank you. I would like to say also, on behalf of the Commission, as well as all those I know with CPS and in the policing world who are with us today, that reconciliation is at the forefront of all of our minds. But we can't get there without truth and justice first. That involves facing the role police have played in the atrocities of our past and in the inequities that continue to this day, and working vigilantly to heal the wounds that have been left by our colonial history. June is National Indigenous History Month, which is something that is not lost on us, particularly this week as we continue to grapple with the news that we have been hearing. And last week was also Aboriginal Awareness Week here. We are blessed on this land with incredibly rich and diverse Indigenous knowledge, cultures, and ways of being. Indigenous knowledge is vital for achieving resilience within our community. And this month in particular, we honor this and pledge to walk the path of reconciliation with honesty and humility. So moving to our meeting, I will first explain the format of this meeting. I'm sure that many of us are looking forward, I know I am, to being able to return to having our meetings in person in the not too distant future. We can certainly hope that the fall, once we've had our summer break, might allow us to do that sooner rather than later. But for now, we are continuing with this virtual meeting format. And once again, using the Zoom webinar, as you know, if you are with us, as our platform. The first thing I would like to note about the Zoom meeting is that the public session of the meeting is now being recorded. You may have, if you noticed on your screen, a notice to that effect. So we can make this meeting available to those who are unable to attend. Among the panelists in this webinar, as you may see, we have commission members, staff of the commission, as well as CPS executive and other representatives of CPS. Joining us as attendees in viewing mode, we have citizen guests and media. We'll hear presentations from CPS on the topics that have been listed on the agenda. Commission members will be invited to ask questions after each presentation. And the commission members will have the ability to use a raise hand feature or a chat where you can put in RTS for request to speak if you would like to ask questions. You may also notice that this webinar has a Q&A feature. I would like to point out that this feature is enabled only to allow our public guests to contact the meeting administrator if you are having technical issues. We are not able to accommodate a live chat during the meeting. We've noticed in the last couple of meetings that there are questions and comments being entered in the chat, and that is not something we are set up to accommodate. As usual, though, citizens who wish to speak to the Commission during our meeting have had an opportunity to register in advance, and that opportunity will come at the end of our agenda when we have a public participation portion. At that time, those individuals who have registered will be invited to unmute your line and to provide your comments. Now, I would also like to take a moment to address the public participation part of our agenda. As you might know, if you have attended our meetings before, these meetings have been for many years now the primary way for Commission to have meetings with CPS in order to gather the information that we need to perform our legislative role as citizen volunteers to oversee CPS. There has recently been a growing interest among citizens who do attend our meetings in being heard on a variety of topics. And we recognize that the time that we are able to provide for this is not lengthy, given how busy our agendas are. We are open to developing new options to allow citizens to communicate your thoughts and perspectives to us as a commission. We are going to take advantage of the summer meeting break to have some work done to evaluate some options for that. And we hope to have more to report on that later this year. Moving along with a little more on the meeting format, before the media Q&A, we will end the public portion of the meeting. Public participants, my fellow commissioners, and CPS will then be asked to sign off so that the chief and I can have some time with our media guests to answer questions at that point. That will give commissioners and CPS a short break before we sign on for our in-camera portion of our meeting. I will now move to our agenda. I'll start by asking for calls of pecuniary interest or conflict of interest. Any such calls from my fellow commissioners? Seeing none and hearing no declarations, I will now ask for approval of the consent agenda. Do I hear any objections to the consent agenda? Hearing none, I declare the consent agenda approved as presented. There's one more item that I would like to address before moving to our formal agenda items, and that is to recognize Pride Month, which is celebrated in June in many communities across Canada. While Calgary Pride moved the parade and the festival from June to September more than 10 years ago, the first Calgary Pride Parade took place on June 16th, 1991. There are events throughout the summer leading up to this parade in September this year. This is a really wonderful opportunity to celebrate diversity and LGBTQ communities, to acknowledge their history and the hardships that this community has endured, and also to acknowledge and recognize the progress that has been made. So moving back to our agenda, as far as the chair's report goes, there is an agenda item 4. I would like to acknowledge that this is the last meeting we will have with Councillors Shahal, Kara, and Commissioner North Pagan. As of September 20th, They will enter full-on campaign mode ahead of the October city election. It's possible that if they are elected, or in the case of Councillors Shahal and Kara re-elected, they may be reappointed by council to the commission, or at least two of them would be for the two commission council members positions. For now, though, we will, as a commission, thank each of them for their significant role that they've played in our work. On behalf of my colleagues, we are very grateful to each of you for advancing the work of the Commission and CPS on behalf of Calgarians. Councillor Shahal, you have helped advance safety throughout the city through the community-based Public Safety Task Force. The task force report and the feedback from the community engagement is contributing to the collaborative approach the city needs to address safety. Councillor Kara, as a champion for making Calgary an anti-racist city, you've created a venue for Calgarians to be heard. That was a powerful experience last summer for so many of us and a catalyst for broad systemic change. And Commissioner North Pagan, who unfortunately is not able to be with us today, she sends her regrets. We do particularly want to recognize Commissioner North Pagan as the longest serving commission member among this group. She has had a seat at this table since 2017. She's been extremely patient as we have all worked to advance gender and racial equity work. And she has offered generously her expansive knowledge, expertise, and her experience to support all of us as a group and as individuals. Personally, I have learned a tremendous amount from Commissioner North Pagan, and I will be forever grateful for that. And of course, she has also brought a matter-of-fact approach and a very frank delivery of powerful insights, which we also all appreciate. But at all times, she has offered that with an unwaveringly positive attitude and a collaborative spirit. And we very much wish her well. She's leaving an enduring legacy on this commission. We want to wish all three of you the best and thank you for the time you have volunteered with this commission. We can now begin the agenda items with CPS in section 5. As I mentioned, we have a very full agenda of presentations today, which is typical before the summer break. The first presentation by CPS will be an update on operational and financial impacts of COVID-19. Chief, I will turn it over to you for that.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good afternoon, Chair and Commission members. And just to echo your comments, Chair, I just really want to thank on behalf of the Calgary Police Service, Councillors Chahal, Councillors Kara, and also Commissioner North Pagan. They have certainly been impactful on the Police Commission over the past number of years, and we too appreciate their contributions and wish them very well moving forward. So we'll see what happens in the fall, but until then, we just leave it with thank you. I'm going to turn over item 5.1, which is the pandemic impact update, as you mentioned, to Deputy Chief Chad Toffick.
Thanks, Chief, and thanks, Chair. I'll break this out into the internal and external perspective, and we'll try to keep it brief, just to give a snapshot of where we're at right now. To date, there's been a total of 156 employees confirmed COVID positive and over 700 employee isolations since the beginning of the pandemic. Currently, after approximately 2 weeks of 0 active cases, we are sitting today at 1 active case and 6 employees in self-isolation, and that's a combination of both sworn and civilian members. Anecdotal feedback indicates that many of our members have actively sought out vaccination. However, due to privacy aspects, we have not been tracking this formally. The remote working continues, and the service has established a return to workplace steering committee who will be making recommendations influenced by various HR processes, organizational policies, safety requirements, IT decisions, etc. We are in communication with our partners with the City of Calgary in relation to their return to work planning and are considering the respective needs of all areas. Of course, our IMT has been monitoring the provincial staged reopening plans and as well the municipal face covering bylaw discussions, and we'll be adjusting our internal protocols to ensure that we are aligned with the legislation that will be in place. Of course, our protective equipment will continue to be offered to employees to use accordingly, and we continue to assess and adjust other business changes implemented in conjunction with the pandemic, including things such as our arrest processing processes, fingerprinting protocols, training methods and capacities, traffic stops and protocols, just to name a few. From an external perspective, we continue to support efforts across the province in and around the Chief Medical Officer of Health public health orders. This includes our work closely with AHS and other provincial partners in conjunction with the Provincial Enforcement Framework for Repeat Offenders. We've continued to monitor and respond to events, protests, demonstrations, and complaints lodged to Alberta Health Services in relation to any violations of the Public Health Act and the municipal bylaws. Over the past month, we've seen an updated order, number 29-2021, which spoke to the expectations of the public pertaining to protests and demonstrations. The service has been supporting organizers in communicating those expectations of public health. We've seen some rallies where the organizers have demonstrated positive compliance and others who continue to demonstrate non-compliance. To that end, to date, we've issued 109 mask bylaw offenses and 149 Public Health Act tickets. In conjunction with the provincial priorities for repeat offenders, the service has followed through with the service of the Court of Queen's Bench order on 16 individuals. 5 of those have been arrested and charged for breaching the order. And recently, 3 of those individuals have been found in contempt of that QB order in court. The Public Health Compliance team continues to work with enforcement partners and support Alberta Health Services with follow-up investigations of commercial and residential complaints of non-compliance. The changes in health measures and opening of business venues to include restaurants and licensed establishments has resulted in increased monitoring of those public establishments across all of our districts. The anticipated changes to the Chief Medical Officer of Health order as Alberta enters stage 3 of the Alberta's Open for Summer plan on July 1st will alter the gathering and other restrictions as well as application of that Court of Queen's Bench order. So on June 21st, City Council voted to extend the municipal bylaw in the short term, but will be revisited with that again on July 5th to determine whether the bylaw will be repealed or will stay in place longer. So as a matter of course, we will be watching that closely and then responding with any changes internally that we need to make. I'll leave it there, and if there's any questions, we can certainly take them.
Thank you very much, Deputy Tofik. I will turn to my commissioners now to see if there are any questions. I'm not seeing any hands up, but feel free to, oh, I do now see one. I don't have all commissioners viewing on my screen at the moment. Commissioner Campbell, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair Croft. Probably for Chief Neufeld and Deputy Chief Tofik, but more of a question around critical thinking and social context education. In reflection on the Ogden incident, the officer in question couldn't bring himself to apologize to the 12-year-old child he arrested in error with significant force. Please describe the elements of the Calgary Police Service training and continuing education program that addresses empathy and understanding, cultural humility, the history of the service's relationship with the LGBTQ2S+ communities, the service's historical relationship with marginalized and vulnerable communities in general, and the concept of intersectionality and where it is demonstrated in Calgary's population.
I'll go ahead. I see you're in your basement, very wise probably on a day like today. I just noticed your backdrop is different.
Yes.
And I understand why.
It's 32 in my home office, so.
When we talk about police training, I think it's really good in the beginning to sort of differentiate between recruit training when officers enter into the organization and then ongoing training that occurs throughout the officer's service. I think in terms of the recruit training, CPS has a very strong program in place presently. Now, that said, as a learning organization, I think it's important that we continue to stay up on all emerging trends and technology. And if our service is going to continue to be a leader nationally in this area, our primary focus, I would say right now, in terms of some of the training that you talk about, is actually in that area of in-service training as it relates to requirements for currently serving members. 2020, obviously, to your point, and the community response to the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis gave us obviously much to think about. Since then, we've augmented our relationships with existing diversity advisory boards that were in place with the Calgary Police Service, as well as added a youth advisory board and also an internal and an external anti-racism committee. Extensive consultations, as well as more recent developments involving the Indigenous community. And so I'm referring to what Chair Croft referred to earlier, the discovery of the remains of children in unmarked graves in the sites of Canadian residential schools certainly has us looking at different ways that we can update that training. What is clear to us, I think, is that the historical relationships between police and the communities that comprise Calgary did not develop uniformly. And I think it would be fair to say that they can't be understood in the aggregate. And at a point, I think that is what we were trying to do as we were conducting surveys. We were looking at the aggregate, and I think we were losing some very important messages in doing that. This is particularly the case, I think, that differential evolution is particularly the case for members of the Indigenous and Black communities. Public trust and confidence, like I say, can't be understood as the whole, and we have to dig deeper with those communities. I think when you ask about the historical relationships, I think the historical relationship has evolved over time. The Calgary Police Service has always been a service that's been well connected to its community and been committed to community-based policing. In fairness, I think that we have quietly become the third most diverse city in the country, and the demographics of the population of Calgary has changed quite a bit over the last little while. I'm not certain that we've evolved as quickly as the external environment has evolved. Today, more than ever, officers must have an understanding of the history of policing in Canada, Alberta, and here in Calgary. They have to understand the issues of systemic racism, prejudice, trauma, and how those things impact vulnerable and marginalized communities here in Calgary. They have to understand discrimination and hate and how that impacts communities in our city and across the country. Based on that 2020 CPC satisfaction survey, it's fair to say that we did see differential sort of responses or differing levels of support in the groups. That was one of the first times I think we've separated out the various segments of the population. And although the differences weren't large, Indigenous and Black citizens did have the lowest perceptions of CPS as compared to other segments of the population. In the Indigenous community, that lower perception manifested in areas like overall satisfaction, quality of service they were experiencing, appropriate visibility in the community, preventing crime with at-risk youth, trust, and the level of care and concern. The Black community registered lower scores around overall satisfaction, trust, fair response to segments of the community, and competency of officers, and also finding information out or access to information about services. So that was interesting. I think you mentioned the LGBTQ community as well in the question, and I think they were not segmented out specifically as part of the research that was done, but nevertheless, from research and from consultation, we know that they can have a distrust of police also, especially when compared against the broader population. I think you also mentioned intersectionality there, and we know that there's members of our population whose identities can intersect. And so I think, for instance, of an Indigenous female who's also a member of the LGBTQ community, we need to understand how those various identities and the impacts in society can compound for that individual, and how police can either help that or hinder in those types of relationships. And that's actually something that's newer for us. We hadn't taught that sort of thing in the past. Currently, we're working with our advisory boards and our anti-racism committees to identify areas of training augmentation. And there's a lot to consider. Police legitimacy, procedural justice, trauma-informed and human-centered design, the history of policing, as I mentioned, anti-racism and allyship training, more advanced Indigenous history and cultural training, and including experiential learning, where we can, working with our partners, to be able to do officer exchanges and this type of thing with First Nations police services. Earlier this month, our ARAC committee formed a training subcommittee to review and make recommendations on this particular issue. And so I think that's a great opportunity for us to do that, to look at the training, both, primarily I'm talking about in service, but also to evolve the recruit training. But on the point of recruit training, I actually think that there's an important piece that begins even before training, and that really relates to who we bring into the organization. And so obviously we have a desire to increase diversity within our police service, but at the same time, I think also motivations of people coming forward to apply for the Calgary Police Service. We want to make sure that the individuals are motivated by desire to serve the community, as opposed to other potential motivations like, thrill seeking or whatever the case might be. So it's a complicated ground for sure, but we're doing a lot of work in this area. And like I say, I think we start in a good place. I think the connections that we have with the community will help us to make this a good opportunity. But actually, I think we are certainly our desire is to continue to be a leader in this area in the country.
Thank you, Chief Neufeld.
Thanks very much for the question and for the detailed response on that. I also see Councillor Chahal's hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Croft. And Deputy Chief Tofik, as you mentioned, so this question's for you or the Chief. Regarding the mask bylaw that's being discussed next week on July the 5th at City Council, I have a couple of questions regarding, number one, vaccinations. Are you able to provide an update if you have, or if you have the information of what the Calgary Police Service members, the percentage of first and second dose vaccinations? But have you been consulted or engaged by Alberta Public Health or the Solicitor General or Justice Minister or Department on your views on masking and issues or concerns that that have arisen in the past, but that may come forward with any changes to these masking bylaws if they're different from the city and the province? And then also, if you want to share, because I know the service has many interactions with the public at police headquarters, at our district offices, concerns on crowding, and the masking bylaw. So I guess the question is, have you been consulted by Public Health, Alberta Public Health, the Solicitor General, the Justice Minister and or Department on changes on the masking bylaw? And do you have any comments, additional comments you'd like to share for myself so that I can bring back to my City Council colleagues on Monday's deliberation on this item?
Thanks, Councillor Chahal. Chad Tofik here. I'll maybe respond to your first question about the percentage of members who may have had first or second doses and the percentages. We don't have the percentages because we haven't been capturing that given privacy. It is a person's medical rights to hold that information. That said, I can say from speaking to a large variety of across the organization, there's been a strong interest in vaccinations, and certainly I suspect that a lot of the organization has already pursued the first, if not the second, doses. With respect to consultation with regard to public health, masking legislation and or face covering legislation, certainly we've been engaged at the provincial levels around enforcement framework around those types of things, and we do appreciate the complexities that come with different layers of legislation, whether it be provincial or municipal. So we have been involved in those discussions as we've been moving along with the enforcement protocols. Ultimately, we're relying on the Chief Medical Officer and their assessment of current state, but I'm not sure if the Chief has had any other feedback at the CP level or anything else. So maybe.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, just to reinforce what Chad said, no direct interaction in relation to the public health portion of the equation. We know, as was said, that that is informing and science is informing the overall relaunch plan. In terms of the number of interactions, you mentioned, Councillor Chahal, around police headquarters here and that sort of thing. There is an enhanced degree of safety in like the front counters because we've got the plexiglass barriers and these sorts of things. So although we are using masks presently as required by the bylaw, I would think that once the masking bylaw comes off, we would be comfortable there. One of the things we talked about is that the overall base rates right now of COVID-19 cases in the population in Calgary here is not very high. So it should be relatively safe. So we're really actually just focusing on what aspects of our business, if any, we do have concerns about, and encouraging officers to continue to use PPE as they would to manage those particular situations. But right now, the majority of the situations that I can think of off the top of my head, we're not overly concerned about it given where we are. But again, I think as we go back into relaunch, this is something we need to continue to monitor quite closely to see if there's increasing numbers of cases in the community. That spells increased risk to the members, and we may have to look at something different. But that's really where we're at as far as masking goes right now.
Thank you, Chief and Deputy Chief.
I see Commissioner Siddiqui's hand up, and after that, we will have to move on to our next agenda item. Go ahead, Commissioner Siddiqui.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Neufeld, I had a question regarding, as you probably know and are very familiar with, the murders that took place in London a few weeks ago, that Muslim family, and the charge today of calling it a murderous terrorist act that's occurred. And we have seen that Islamophobia is spreading across Canada. And so I'm curious to know how the service is handling those items, particularly because in former years, when there was sort of that, I guess for lack of a better term, the international terrorism and folks who were being groomed into that locally, there was the redirect program that was launched. There was criminal intelligence that was gathered, and the service was quite active in ensuring that folks like that were assessed quickly and taken care of. So I'm curious, as we move into this domestic terrorism, what the service is doing. Are you doing anything with your counterparts nationally or even locally? And how are we ensuring that the Muslim community is feeling protected, specifically Muslim women? There is a lot of information on social media right now because people can't meet because of COVID, of course, but folks talking about the police can't protect us, so we're going to start protecting ourselves. We want to carry bear spray. We want to carry knives. It's almost like a vigilante because they feel like they can't defend, there's no one there to protect them. So I'm curious if you can talk about, please, or if any of your deputy chiefs can, about what's being done and how do we ensure that they feel safe with all of this happening?
I can certainly start, Commissioner Siddiqui, and then we can pass it on if anybody else wants to add. I think obviously the situation that you referred to in London is a horrible situation that still actually, I think haunts many people. I think part of it is we have been clear in the past, and we're as clear today, that there is no place for Islamophobia or hate or transphobia or any of the other sorts of phobias that are out there in our community. And we always have taken a very strong approach to these types of crimes, and we continue to do that. I think at the same time, I think we have seen an uptick in these sorts of events over the past since probably the midpoint in the pandemic, we've seen an uptick. So we're working with the community, and we continue to do that through our diversity folks and our community resource officers to encourage and to support, to undertake the things that we need to do when events happen, either here or around the world, to add extra supports, extra patrols, have meetings, do the things that we need to do, try to make sure that we're well connected with the public, with the community, and just make sure that people are feeling okay after and have the information they need to sort of take out some of the, some of the rumors and that sort of thing that can end up going around as a result of social media and this type of thing. I think at the last meeting, I think we had a presentation on the redirect program, which has actually been a very successful program here in Calgary, as you referenced, and one that's actually being looked at elsewhere. I think the intelligence communities tend to be well connected across the province and across the country when there are individuals that are suspected of being radicalized toward violence, in this sort of arena. I'm not so sure that the individuals that were involved in the London matter there were on the radar at all, which can happen also, right? And I think it's probably a cautionary tale to communities about having programs like that. And I think having close ties with the community so that when there is threats out there, somebody will be likely to reach out. So anyway, that's sort of what we have going on right now. I think the emphasis has to be on Muslim women for the reason that you mentioned. There has definitely been an uptake in some very high profile cases where individuals have been accosted or assaulted. And so that's hugely problematic and hugely goes to the community safety. We continue to encourage people not to carry bear spray and not to carry weapons and that sort of thing, because that in the past has exacerbated some of these problems. But we are certainly in a time where we have to continue to keep a very close eye on this and also keep very close ties with the community and make sure we continue to provide those supports where we can, because it is a very difficult time when this is happening, and what happens anywhere in the country and around the world impacts home. So yeah, I appreciate your question, and I hope that's a reasonable answer. I'm not sure if anybody else wants to add. No takers.
Well, thank you very much for that. And as I mentioned, we will now move on to our next agenda item, which is not unrelated. It is an update on the anti-racism action plan within CPS. This is a regular check-in on our agendas, as those of you, our guests who come more often will know. Go ahead to the chief, or do you have one of those in the room with you presenting this agenda item?
Yes, I'll hand over to Deputy McClellan for the purposes of this report. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Chief. Thanks very much, Chair, and Commissioner Siddiqui. Thanks for that past question. I'll include it here in my speaking notes. As always, we've had a very busy month, so please bear with me as I go through all of the updates. So prior to providing a full update, we, like Chair Croft, would like to acknowledge that the CPS is deeply impacted and has been deeply impacted following the discovery of the burial sites of Indigenous children at former residential schools in BC and Saskatchewan. We've been working closely with the community to ensure that resources and supports are available. We will continue to grieve and heal with our community. Our strategic Indigenous engagement officer has been involved in outreach with the community in relation to the Kamloops residential school burial site. We have been ensuring that resources are available through our Victims Assistance Support Team for community members to access in light of the recent discovery in Saskatchewan last week. The Chief talked just briefly about the formation of our anti-racism training subcommittee focused on developing mandatory anti-racism and implicit bias training for all CPS members. I can share with you that just this morning, the ELT and the SLT received a presentation on racial trauma from Anne Scherschkemer, the trauma specialist on our ARAC. The subcommittee is also committed to engaging with a wide range of community organizations that are at the highest risk of being impacted by racism to assist in raising awareness about harassment, discrimination, and hate. Having said that, I think it's prudent that typically in the past, I wouldn't give some updates on hate crimes, but given just the conversation that we've had and what's been occurring, I'd like to just share a couple of points. We take each report of hate crimes seriously. Our hate crimes teams and extremism team reviews and investigates each file with a hate or bias theme. The team consults with a dedicated hate crimes crime prosecutor to receive guidance on appropriateness of charges. And as we said, we did have that presentation some months ago, so I'll just keep it high level. To date in 2021, there have been a total of 81 hate-themed incidents that have occurred in Calgary. This contrasts with 73 for the entire year in 2019, and then 120 in 2020. Of the 81 files investigated in 2021, 13 files have resulted in charges that will move forward as a hate crime. The remaining files continue to be reviewed by our hate crimes team. However, some do not meet the threshold at this time of being designated as a hate event. For interest, the primary motivating factors for 2021 cases are as follows. Race and ethnicity is 47, religion 14, language 4, sexual orientation 10, and unknown still under investigation are 5. While we have started creating awareness amongst our advisory boards, the hate crime teams is working with our public affairs and our diversity teams to arrange hate crime town halls to provide more education on what a hate crime is citywide. Last week, members of our community services section held a 2-day information session for 27 sworn Calgary Police Service members who have volunteered to assist in the diversity liaison function at protest. As you've heard me talk earlier, that we just don't have the capacity, and so we're looking at additional deployment models to assist us. This training included components on hate crimes, crowd management techniques, verbal de-escalation, and negotiation training, as well as an overview of diverse communities and cultural considerations in a protest setting. Yesterday, as to Commissioner Siddiqui's question just a few moments ago, our leadership team in the Community Services section met with the Muslim Council of Calgary, the MCC. The community, as we just heard, has grave concerns about the recent uptrend in Islamophobia. The following commitments have been made to the MCC to mitigate concerns and reinforce a perception of safety in the Muslim community. These include emergency preparedness and crime prevention through environmental design for all Islamic sites in Calgary as requested by the MCC. Mapping of all the Islamic sites in our computer-aided dispatch system to assist in emergency calls to those facilities. The creation of a hate crime, hate incident brochure for all of the members of the community. Coordination of personal safety and crime prevention training for female members of the Muslim community in partnership with the Center for Newcomers. Having said all of that, we know that the training is just not enough. We are hearing from our communities about our engagement, and we are currently, as I said, assessing our deployment model and discussing how we can better serve all of our communities. Earlier, I referenced the chief referenced the anti-racism training and education subcommittee, which is being led by Inspector Martin and Katie Doucette. Membership on the committee consists of members from both internal and our external ARAC. Members of the diversity unit and the recruiting unit are also represented, which will be beneficial for the community engagement aspects of that subcommittee. ARAC recently reviewed the Alberta Anti-Racism Advisory Council recommendations, which was released in March of 2021. 25 recommendations have been identified as being related to the training subcommittee. These have been prioritized and 13 recommendations have been selected for immediate action, and I will continue to report on those. The recent House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security recommendations from earlier this month will be tabled at future ARAC meetings to strategize on how they can be incorporated into an action plan for us. It's very important that provincial and national pieces of work be leveraged to inform localized strategy. Earlier this month, members of the executive CPS leadership team met with several anti-racism advocates. It is important that the voices of all individuals be considered in our communities and our commitments to anti-racism, and we have committed to meeting with as many people as we can. As a result of these conversations, we have had a recommendation come forward with respect to our members handing out a card with their names and regimental information on that. We are exploring that, and we are currently discussing that with our ARAC and our advisory boards. To date, we have had 4 internal and external ARAC meetings. Many of these have been high-level conversations centered around laying the foundation for our journey. However, from here, we know and we will commit to delivering on tangible action items and moving this strategy forward. With respect to our Indigenous roadmap, in recognition of National Indigenous Peoples Day on June 21st, the Métis flag was raised at West Wind headquarters. The Child Advocacy Centre held a ceremony on June 21st to reveal their sacred space, which will be used as a culturally safe space for victims of abuse and their families to share their pain and begin their healing journey. The Urban Society for Aboriginal Youth have teamed with local Indigenous artist Callum Tiki-Dan to begin construction on the sacred space at CPS headquarters, that work began on June 4th, and you've heard me talk about that earlier. Talking circles have taken place between 5 Calgary Police Service members and 5 youth from the Urban Society for Aboriginal Youth about various topics to include in their new Tribe magazine, Police Specific Edition, for release in the fall of 2021. To date, 3 of these sessions have occurred. It is anticipated that this partnership will transfer knowledge, provide support, and build and bridge relationships. With assistance and guidance from the Indigenous community, the CPS is scheduled to set up its teepee on the Stampede grounds during the 10 days of festivities. We have also been actively working with our Indigenous community ahead of planning and preparations for July 1st. Our police and community engagement team, as well as our diversity resources team, are scheduled to attend several high events across the city on Thursday. One of our Indigenous Advisory Board members has been invited to the 2 most recent graduations to conduct smudging ceremonies. The procurement process has begun for the placement of 3 flag poles at CPS headquarters to symbolize the nation-to-nation relationship that the CPS has with Treaty 7 and the Métis Nation of Alberta. Exploration of the Indigenous Liaison Officer Program continues, and we continue to get requests and questions about that. Our advisory boards and elders had cautioned about prematurely implementing this program, as I have shared in the past, without proper education and awareness for all of our membership in and around Indigenous affairs. This feedback, in fact, was the impetus for us standing up the Iraq Subcommittee on anti-racism and implicit bias training for our members. To be fully inclusive and consultation with members from the Indigenous communities, we are currently exploring the opportunity to conceive an Elders Council where representatives from each area in Treaty 7 would inform the strategic direction of the organization as it pertains to our reconciliation efforts. We're also reevaluating our Indigenous roadmap in light of current events to ensure that outcomes are contemporary and are keeping with community expectations. Just quickly on our SRO evaluation, a draft evaluation report on the program is expected from the consultant this week, and we expect to share the report and the recommendations with the CPC in September. Some advisory board updates. In the month of June, all diversity advisory boards received presentations on race-based data, hate crimes, and the thin blue line. Earlier this month, we partnered with Deaf and Hear Alberta to produce and distribute traffic brochure visor cards. These have been distributed to traffic and district offices. Some of you may have seen this in the media. These graphics will enhance communication with the hearing loss community. Further counter loops have now been installed at all district offices to enhance in-person interaction with the hearing loss community at all of our facilities. Deaf and Hear Alberta participated in a joint media availability in the month of June. Our Person with Disabilities and Caribbean board chairs provided presentations to our recruits during including diversity training, which was very well received. Conversations with the Muslim Council of Calgary have resulted in the Islamic School Board appealing to us to expand the SRO program into their schools, which we will explore once our SRO review is completed. Our Gender and Sexual Diversity Advisory Board also created a brochure which advisory board members can distribute at community events or send electronically to share with the larger community as to the activities and accomplishments of the boards. Our Youth Advisory Board was mentioned briefly. We had our second meeting with them on June 16th, just an incredible group of young people. The board has now become fluent in governance and board functions due to coaching and guidance by Constable Ron Kubicek. At this meeting, the mission statement was finalized by the board, and it was decided that a co-chair would not be selected until meetings can resume in person, which we hope to do in the fall. The board prioritized issues facing young persons, and of interest, the top 4 priorities they recommended and suggested are mental health, bullying and racism, addictions, and perceptions of police and brutality. The next meeting scheduled for July 21st will be focused on developing action plans to explore some of these priorities. Just quickly, I'll talk about the Community Safety Investment Framework. On June 3rd, on June 3rd this year, ourselves, City Administration, and the Commission, as you know, made a joint announcement on the funding programs and initiative. In total, the CSIF funded 23 projects, and the CPS budget reallocation funded 26 projects. The names of funded projects were made public on our website and the city's website. The media was invited to tune in as Mayor Nenshi, Chair Croft, and Chief Neufeld held a virtual media conference. On June 8th, myself and Director Melanie Husker from Calgary Neighborhoods gave a presentation to the Council's Priorities and Finance Committee. The committee recommended Council, there was 2 recommendations that were recommended, and I won't read them. I'm sure everyone can see and has read them on the website. As part of the Community Safety Investment Framework, the city awarded a research contract to a consultant to assist in a discovery phase to transforming Calgary's crisis response system. On June 21st, the C7 reallocation were presented to full City Council. There were no questions and it was supported. I will now turn it over to Deputy Gill for an EDI update.
Thank you. And further to Deputy McClellan's anti-racism action plan update, the final piece of that one from within the Calgary Police Service is our work that we're doing around EDI. And just to maybe give a little background or refresh your memory, we have 4 pilot areas that we're working on. 2 are internal facing and 2 are external facing. Internally, there's the Skills and Procedures Unit at the Chief Crowfoot Learning Center, and our recruitment and selection of positions in our support services, which includes tactical units, canine unit, marine unit, and mounted patrol. The 2 external facing one is our public complaints process and our info post policy and process. Significant progress has been made in the pilot areas to date, where we are creating an understanding of biases and how they can be embedded in a process or practice, how to engage on these issues and collect disaggregated race-based data. There are already recommendations emerging from the pilot areas on how this work can be rolled out to the wider service and build the buy-in that we require to advance this and broader anti-racism efforts. The pilot workshops are wrapping up in early July, which will be followed by engagement with the internal and external anti-racism committees. The final EDI report will be delivered to the Commission in the fall of this year. And finally, we delivered a brief presentation to the Cps Anti-Racism Subcommittee earlier this month with our University of Calgary partner, Lana Wells. And we want to thank both the CPC members who provided feedback on our submissions to the Government of Alberta for the Police Act reform on sexual harassment. So that's the update on the EDI work that we're undertaking. And with that, we can open up any questions that the Commission members have.
Thanks very much to both deputies for those reports. I will look to my colleagues for any questions. Not seeing any hands at the moment. I will ask one very brief question on your update, Deputy McClellan, about SRO program. And I know we're all looking forward to hearing your full report in September on that. I was interested in what you mentioned about the request to have the SRO program extended to the Islamic school. Would this be the first, if it was to proceed, would this be the first entry into charter or private schools, or are there already examples of those outside the public and the separate school system?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question, Chair. And so this is the first outside of the public and the private schools. So as everyone has probably been following, there's almost everyone across the country has decided to withdraw their SRO program. And so I was actually asked about it yesterday at another meeting that we had yesterday afternoon with YouthLink and the foundation. And a couple of key pieces that I just quickly mentioned was we have fantastic relationships with our boards, and we look forward to those further partnerships with that community as well. And I think one of the differences across the country is that the Calgary Police Service were the ones who led this evaluation, and some of you may know that, whereas in many other police services across the country, it was the boards, the school boards, who asked for that evaluation and that review. So I just mentioned that very briefly because it just reinforces the fantastic relationship that we have, and we're excited to have that extended invitation. And as I said, we'll reassess that in the fall.
Thanks, Deputy. Commissioner Cornett, I see your hand up.
Thank you. A fairly short question and doesn't need a long answer, but you've mentioned around communication. Individual committees have published brochures, they're handing them out when they're at events, and various other pieces of communication like that. Given all that's going on, can you comment on a larger systemic communication plan that you might have, or a strategy overall to try and tie these things together and just evaluate how progress is being made? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much. Great question, and I'll keep it short. So we have been working on that for the last couple of months. There's been many pieces, kind of many balls in the air. And Commissioner Cornett, we have committed to bringing forward our full communication strategy in September to the ARAC committee. So unless you wanted some additional specifics, it's still a plan in flight. And we are nearing the finishing ends, and we'll be bringing it forward in September.
No, I can wait till September. Thank you. I'm just glad that it's being worked on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, seeing no other hands, thank you once again for those thorough reports. And we are now ready to move on to the third of the chief's reports under the chief's report section of the agenda. Section 5.3 is a crime update. I'm going to assume that Deputy Cook is in the room for that.
Would have assumed wrong this time. But this is going to be a joint effort there by Deputy Toffick and Acting Superintendent Wagner, who is here on behalf of Deputy Chief Cook.
Well, welcome.
Thanks, Chief. I'll kick things off here. So just getting into the summary of the key items that we'll talk about from the Bureau of Community Policing, focusing some of the information around our 5 priorities within the annual policing plan, which were reducing gun violence, addressing drug-related harm, reducing property crimes such as break and enter, protecting vulnerable people, and lastly, increasing road safety. So I'll kind of frame it around that and give some examples of some really good work going on across the districts and across the service that demonstrate that. Specific to the drug-related harm and reducing gun violence, we have a couple of operations that I'd just like to highlight. One out of District 4, due to some corroboration of some intelligence and information that led to the identification of 2 individuals there who were selling drugs and in possession of multiple firearms. Through surveillance and investigative tactics, our district operations team confirmed activity consistent with that drug trafficking. On June 15th of this year, 7 warrants were executed at 3 residences and on 4 vehicles, resulting in the seizure of approximately $516,000 worth of drugs, inclusive of methamphetamine, crack, and as well as powder, cocaine, fentanyl, and other drugs. As well, in excess of $15,000 cash was seized. In those warrants, we also recovered 6 firearms, including handguns, rifles, and a revolver, as well as a taser and assorted ammunition, which was also seized. 3 individuals were arrested and charged with numerous drugs and weapon-related offenses in relation to that one. So a very good, a focused investigation there. Second one that I'll focus on is out of District 6, an operation that was initiated out of some confidential information regarding a residence in Woodbine involved in drug trafficking. Covert surveillance on the residence led to the identification of a suspect who was engaged in activity consistent with drug trafficking. On June 10th, a search warrant was executed at the residence and the associated vehicles involved, resulting in a seizure of a .22 caliber handgun, quantities of cocaine, methamphetamine, fentanyl, and OxyContin, approximately $340,000 in cash, and assorted stolen property linked to 3 different break and enters. 1 individual was arrested and charged with the firearms investigative team is examining the handgun to determine if it was legally obtained. On a side note, during the execution of those search warrants, 3 different community neighbors approached the members of our district operations team while they were on scene to thank them, as it was a problem drug house with ongoing issues for the community over the last period of time. Moving to the reducing property crime, we had another district, District 8, and working with other investigative units across the city, recognized a series of approximately 15 high-end electronic thefts, which were identified throughout the city and associated with the same offender driving the same vehicle. That suspect was identified by the crime analyst to be selling high-end products, high-end electronics on Facebook Marketplace, and by matching that property with other break and enters and different thefts, they were able to initiate an operation there and engage them in a covert operation to identify the 2 offenders, which resulted in 2 residences being identified and search warrants being executed at both, resulting in the recovery of $15,000 worth of stolen property. 1 person has been charged and the investigation continues on the others. Going out to protecting vulnerable people, I need to highlight this one. a very significant event in relation to a stabbing in progress incident in District 2 around 12:40 p.m. on Friday, June 11th. District 2 members were called to a building on West Valley Road that contains residences, an office, a church, and a daycare that was in progress at the time for a man that had reportedly entered the building and began stabbing individuals there. Our officers responded very efficiently to that location, initiated the rescue task force training, which is combined with EMS and fire to ensure we provide assistance to those who might be injured or worse. They were able to locate the subject very quickly and were able to de-escalate the situation to the point that he surrendered without any lethal use of force. Fortunately, neither of the individuals there succumbed to the injuries. Medical aid was able to be rendered. The response to that event was very swift. The first officers into the building were tasked with finding and stopping the threat, followed by a second wave of officers who helped EMS and firefighters evacuate and treat anyone who may have been injured. That rescue task force approach is somewhat unique in Canada and certainly led to efficient medical care for those individuals. Ultimately, the timely response and rapid intervention of our officers enabled them to intervene accordingly and prevent further harm to the public and also the subjects involved. They were able to evacuate and secure the daycare in the building as well, which was impressive. All of this happened within 16 minutes of time. And as I'm sure you can appreciate, that stuff happens very rapidly and our members have to make very quick decisions. And all in all, we were pleased that we were able to limit the harm in that situation. Lastly, I'll just touch on briefly increasing road safety and some of the work over June. The Alberta Transportation Traffic Safety Plan for June focused on commercial vehicle safety. So we're talking about large commercial vehicles, the risk those pose on our highways and roadways. As part of the focus for that month, our members in traffic worked in partnership with the Alberta Sheriff's Highway Patrol and conducted a number of joint force operations at a number of different locations in Calgary on June 16th, June 23rd. Some significant defects were identified in the vehicle stopped. On one occasion, a total number of 39 commercial vehicles were inspected, with 32 being put out of service, 82% that being the number. 3 requiring attention, that's 8%, and 4 actually passed. A number of violations were issued. And in addition to that, on that occasion, there were 2 arrests, 1 for warrants and 1 for driving while suspended. On the 23rd, members of our traffic and commercial vehicle trained officers were part of the joint forces operation with Alberta Sheriff Highway Patrol at Jumping Pound. What we see is, of course, these trucks are moving in and out of the region, so it's of interest to us to work with our partners around this. They were able to inspect 30 commercial vehicles, with 21 being put out of service, so 70% were actually put out of service, 3 requiring attention and 6 passed. 30 tickets were issued as a result of that enforcement. As I'm sure you can appreciate, the word gets around with commercial vehicles and the vendors using them when we do this type of enforcement. So that focus was really put out there to make sure that we can get everyone to make sure their vehicles are in good standard and quality. So next month we'll be focusing on impaired driving, which I think is timely given the stages of reopening and relaunch with the province. So I'll be looking forward to reporting on that. Lastly, on June 22nd, District 8 GIU issued a public safety warning about safe buying and selling transactions due to an increase in thefts and robberies between buyers and sellers using social media sites. We've had 75 reported robbery and thefts during public buy and sell transactions to date this year, 26% of which included violence or threats of violence. So we've been working to try on the prevention side to educate the public on safe ways to do those transactions, as well as coordinating across all districts to focus on the offenders around that activity. We did a public media release and social media supporting that to help people do those transactions in the safest manner possible. I'll leave it there. I'll turn it over to Nadine for her update on your investigative support.
Thanks, Deputy. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to bring an update of a crime summary from the Bureau of Investigative Support. So today we are currently sitting at 6 homicides for the year. In comparison to last year, we had our 6th homicide of the year by February 10th. By June 30th, 2020, we were sitting at 16 homicides for the year. The last year we were at midpoint for the year with fewer than 7 homicides was 10 years ago in 2011. And despite all the low numbers in 21, our homicide unit investigators and analysts are busy preparing for court and attending for all last year's homicides. In the first half of 2020, we had 6 homicides related to organized crime and gang activity. This year, we've had 1. This would indicate that suppression efforts and enforcements by our members are having an impact in preventing and reducing organized crime-related shootings and homicides. To date, there have been 4 confirmed shootings in the month of June, which is below the 5-year average for June, which is usually 8, and well below the 14 shootings that occurred in June of last year. In the first 6 months of 2021, there have been 36 shootings, which is a 37% decrease of number of shootings in the first 6 months of last year. 3 of the 4 shootings in June were deemed to be organized crime related, and the 4th is undetermined and currently under investigation. While these numbers are good, we are aware that some organized crime members have recently been released from custody, and there's potential for increased violence during the summer months. We are also aware of increased travel into Calgary area from BC by some known organized crime offenders, and this activity is being monitored closely and actioned accordingly. Since the beginning of the year and until the end of May, CPS have seized 272 crime guns. So almost 300 guns have been removed from Calgary streets in the first 5 months of 2021. Additionally, since the year's start, CPS has laid 362 charges against 69 offenders for incidents of violence where a gun was present. Our probe team, an intelligence support unit, recently concluded an operation that resulted in the removal of $1 million worth of drugs from our streets. This demonstrates our commitment to targeting drug traffickers to help reduce public harm. Drugs removed included 11,000 grams of fentanyl, almost 500 grams of methamphetamine, 200 grams of cocaine, 87 oxycodone pills, and a smaller amounts of heroin, crack, and other unknown substances. The value of these drugs is estimated just under $1.2 million, with several trafficking charges laid and proceeds of crime. The last piece I'd like to comment on is our work around interprovincial collaboration across British Columbia. Several units within the Criminal Operations and Intelligence Division are continually engaged with police agencies in British Columbia through bi-weekly conference calls. This operation is called Spectrum. We are also engaged with gang enforcement and intelligence units in the Greater Toronto Area with bi-weekly and monthly conference calls to manage that intelligence across the country. An example of suppression and prevention effort and enforcement recently occurred on June 26th. CPS received complaints that a handgun was being waved around a vehicle in Martindale. CPS members responded, conducting a high-risk vehicle traffic stop, and 2 known and monitored organized crime offenders were located within the vehicle. The firearm was not located at this time and believed to be tossed and yet to be recovered. However, it is believed this T-stop may have prevented a significant violent incident. These 2 offenders are currently targets of the gang enforcement team under Operation Gabbro. Those are my updates for now. Take any questions.
Well, thanks very much for all of those updates. It's certainly good to hear some positive news in those reports, particularly that the gang suppression work seems to be having good effects. So that is good to hear. Also very good and interesting to hear about the interprovincial cooperation that your gang suppression team is engaged in. I will turn to my colleagues to see if there are any questions. I have not seen any hands raised yet. Perhaps that means your report was so thorough that you have stumped us today, which I think we can all say is probably a first. So once again, thank you very much. Those were excellent reports. I will now then move on to the next agenda item, which is the annual report from the professional standards section. Chief, who will be presenting this report?
Yes, thank you. Very pleased to present this report to you today. It will be presented by Superintendent Scott Boyd and Ms. Jamie Butt.
Thanks very much, Chief. Good afternoon, everybody. 2020 was a year of significant conduct reform within the Calgary Police Service. These changes come with a lot of data, but more importantly, they come with exciting stories to tell. Based on past report feedback, the Calgary Police Service looked and examined our previous submissions and took the feedback of that it lacked detail, that there was misunderstanding of the data that we were presenting. So we assembled a team, and I think they've done a great job of fleshing out these stories, but also trying to have them make sense to the many different audiences that this document is meant to serve. Many of those audiences are represented today online. Today, we'll launch the sharing of these stories, including a media release, internal communication, and this public presentation. I'll now turn it over to Jamie Budd, our business strategist and project lead.
Thanks, Superintendent. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to present the 2020 PSS annual report. And today I'd like to focus on 5 stories. We'll just get the slides up here. Can everybody see the presentation okay? Awesome.
I can, thank you.
Great, thank you. So today I'd like to focus on 5 stories, the first of which being the 2020 successes and challenges to help set the context for the annual results. Second, we'll look at how much PSS is doing. We'll look at the new complaint files that were opened in 2020. These numbers reflect some of the challenges that we encountered last year. Third, we'll look at how well is PSS doing the work by looking at the number of complaint files that were closed, how many need an investigation, and how long it takes to close those files. This information also speaks to many of the process improvements and efficiencies that were made in 2020. We'll also present some information on the outcomes of those complaint files. Although it seems strange to talk about discipline and who's better off, this speaks to the accountability and transparency outcomes we want to achieve for CPS, the Commission, as well as for our citizens. Finally, I'll end on a positive note to look at the compliments paid to the service and our officers, and then turn it back to the Superintendent, who will conclude by discussing next steps. PSS made significant process improvements and developed new initiatives to increase transparency and accountability, as well as to educate our stakeholders. Some of the successes include launching the community accountability website to increase transparency, holding weekly meetings with the chief, our executive leadership team, and HR for updates and direction. Investigators are also required to complete quarterly file reviews to identify barriers and possible efficiencies. There's a new distributed responsibility initiative to address conduct concerns at the district level. We've also created learning modules to educate officers and commissioners about PSS. Some of the challenges include managing limitations of the Police Act, which creates more and sometimes unnecessary work for this section. PSS provided feedback on this in the engagement sessions to the Minister. We're continuing to manage and help our partners in ACERT and the Crown deal with their resources. because that can extend some of our file investigation times. And we're, as many of us have talked about today, changes in policing and public interactions due to COVID public health orders may have led to more complaints in 2020, as well as societal expectations of police accountability, transparency, and fair treatment of the BIPOC community. So with that context in mind, we can see that there were more files opened in 2020 compared to 2019. Citizen complaints increased by 14%, and CPS or internal complaints increased by 77%. Compared to historical data, we can see in the bottom graph that complaints have been trending up since 2018. So PSS is seeing higher caseloads. On this slide, we showed the main theme or classification for citizen and CPS complaints. As expected, the top themes for each group are a little different, although professionalism was the most frequent complaint for both. Citizen professionalism complaints were about how the officer lacked empathy, was rude, exceeded their authority, or had an unprofessional tone of voice or demeanor. While CPS complaints on professionalism were more focused on off-duty behavior, deceit, and the failure to follow policy. Citizens also complained about the duties and services provided to them, such as an inappropriate police response or that they were dissatisfied with a ticket or charge. And they also complained about other issues like deficient or negligent investigations. In contrast, common CPS complaints were on use of force and various supervision or workplace issues. The addition of this data in 2020 is an important process improvement, as it will allow PSS to better track how complaints change over time and other trends and impacts to their work processes. So not only did we see more files opened in 2020, but we also saw more files closed. In the chart on the left, we see that PSS closed 348 complaints, which is up 19% over 2019. Of those 348 complaints, 150 were formally investigated. Again, this is up from the 5-year average. This means that not only did we close more files, but more files were also formally investigated in 2020. And on average, those files take more time to conclude than other files. So it shows here that it takes on average 658 days, that's 1.8 years, to close a file through a formal investigation. This average, of course, is impacted by the closure of the aging files, which is shown in the chart on the right. Here we can see in 2020, 18% of the investigative files closed were 4 years or older. In comparison, these aging files made up only 7% of closures in 2019. So this means that despite increasing caseloads in 2020, PSS was still able to reduce the backlog of aging files. And it is important to remember that each file has its own story, and more complex files require more complex investigation. In some cases, that investigation is completed by ACERT or the RCMP. So we sent 17 new files to those agencies last year, whereas other cases involve criminal charges and have to work their way through the justice system before they come back to PSS. So that was 35 new criminal files in 2020. So looking forward to 2021, we hope to better capture and communicate this information. So being able to quantify how long a file sits with ACERT or goes through the criminal system, and see if there are any opportunities for us to better support our partners or to make improvements within the service. In the report, we go into detail about the complaint process and the different outcomes for complaint files. We produce an infographic and simple definitions to help audiences understand the complex and not always linear process for complaints. So of those 348 complaints that were closed in 2020, 56% were resolved informally with complainant agreement. So this happens most often through discussion between all the parties or through supervisor intervention. We saw discipline sustained in 14% of closed files. This includes 38 files where allegations were sustained without a hearing and 9 that were sustained within a disciplinary hearing. So in total, these files involved 50 officers and 90 sustained allegations. These officers are held accountable to their actions through appropriate disciplinary measures, including official warnings, lost overtime hours, and suspension of duty without pay. Finally, in 15% of complaints, the allegations were not sustained, and 14% of complaints were dismissed, mostly due to officer retirement or resignation. Finally, 2% were withdrawn by the complainant. And we will just note that 2020 saw a significant increase in the number of cases dismissed due to officer retirement. This is more a result of external changes to the retirement benefits, which made early retirement attractive. So it may or may not be related to the complaint at all. And so we might see some skewing of the data here in 2020, and we might see a similar trend for next year as well. 2020, TSS received 326 written compliments, a 7% increase over 2019's 305. Compliments range from citizens thanking officers for the everyday things they do on and off the job to supporting citizens during specific incidents of trauma and crisis. As we can see in the word cloud here, citizens appreciated that officers were professional, compassionate, kind, prompt, and thorough in their interactions or investigations. Many citizens also wanted to convey their support of the police during all the challenges experienced in 2020.
Fairly full.
I'll turn it over to the superintendent to wrap up.
It's in church and.
So there's still some work to be done, and we remain committed to continuing to improve these process improvements. Some of the initiatives that we're looking at are our major case management approach. So much like complex homicide files, we're piloting a major case management approach within professional standards, which allows us to take those complex investigations, take a team approach in tasking those details to hopefully conclude the file in a more expedient manner. This data is allowing us to share trends across our organization and educate our members on the types of behavior certain areas or districts are more prone to be reported against, and allow me to work with my counterpart, Executive Director Thompson, in the Learning Center to get education specific to those areas that our members are experiencing. It also allows us to increase our communication with CPA President Orr and SOA President Francois, and to allow facts to surface around our reform efforts. We're also focused on enhancing public trust as we work to civilianize some of our investigator roles. We're developing with a third-party external EDI tool to be applied to our intake policy process, to ensure that there's no barriers that we're aware of that would prevent certain individuals from coming forward to express their experience with the police service. And finally, we're working to improve employee satisfaction through the development of this distributed responsibility initiative. The number one complaint from both citizens and our members is how long it does take to conclude some of these complex files. Having this distributed responsibility allows us to gain some investigative capacity across the organization to decrease those timelines. That concludes our presentation today, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for that excellent report. I will turn first to Commissioner Lynch-Proctor and then Commissioner Campbell.
Hi, thanks, Chair Crofton. Thank you for that report. One of the challenges that you raised was around the need for reform of the Police Act. Could you just summarize what the one or two most impactful amendments to the Police Act might be to enhance the PSS and complaint process from an accountability, efficiency, and effectiveness perspective?
There's a number of different submissions that we made, or a submission with a number of different, I guess, aspects to it. I think if I were to try to quickly distill it down to one or two of the most important, I would tell you that I think there was pretty strong alignment across all parties, including the Calgary Police Service and the policing community, with many others, that there should be a third party and independent investigative body, or at the very least, if that can't be done, a body that would at least receive and triage complaints. That would be a lot more helpful in terms of the the concerns that are raised about how complaints are classified and dealt with, if they were taken in by a third party, that would take out some of that stuff. So I think that's a really big one that would help to streamline things for us. Somebody who would actually receive the complaint and sort of particularize what this is. Is it criminal? Is it non-criminal? If it's a Police Act complaint, what are the particular allegations? And then even if that goes to the police service afterwards, there's a lot of difficulty and I think conflict over that initial piece. So that's one. The other, I think, is a very significant issue as well, and that relates to the overlap around harassment, bullying and harassment, and sexual harassment, sort of workplace complaints that are being dealt with currently under the Police Act right now. So we know that there's also jurisdiction under the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which is a piece of legislation that deals with a lot of workplace safety issues. Those two are actually being a little bit conflated, and there's some, I think, a lack of clarity around how those should go. So what we were looking at as well is making a recommendation to remove those also, potentially to be dealt with by a third party. But if not, I think we just need clarity around who's going to deal with them and under what legislation, whether there's some paramountcy in one legislation or one piece of legislation or another, because that's a significant issue right now. And it's one that actually there's a lot of confusion around. And I think the legislative regime is part of the confusion. So those are probably two of the big pieces. But there was probably, I don't even remember the number, but there was a number of recommendations that we put forward in relation to Police Act reform.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I know others have questions, so I'll just ask one more. On your new public accountability website, you are including and just in the beginning stages of including race-based data on complainants. And I appreciate it's a new initiative. I just want to get your impressions so far. Is there anything coming out of the data that surprises you? And can you perhaps give us an update on when we can expect the Statistics Canada undertaking or project to come to completion, so there's actually standardized?
Not till next year.
Thanks very much, Commissioner. The second part of your question isn't expected to come back until 2022. That's a very complex work being done by Deputy McClellan's Bureau. And so that will come next year. The first piece is no real surprising trends. We are capturing some of the data as it relates to differentially applying the law based on race. And those numbers are quite small up to this point in time. I believe we're at 6 the last time that I checked. And most of that, some of it applies to based on race, some of it is gender, some of it is age. So those 6 are taking on all those different forms of those allegations for us to investigate. We hope to come with more robust conversation in September when we come back to COC committee with that data at the half-year mark.
Thank you.
Commissioner Campbell.
Thank you very much, Chair Croft. I have 2 questions, but I'll ask the easier one first. In the data for the 2020 results, how does the data for complaints and closures and processes compare to other police services nationally, specifically Toronto, Edmonton, Montreal, and Vancouver?
Good question, Commissioner Campbell. So I have the Edmonton comparisons, but I won't share specifics out of respect for that police agency. Like us, they're just going before their commission with those details. But in broad strokes, I can share that Edmonton and Calgary did open very similar numbers of complaints in 2020. The Calgary Police Service closed significantly more files, probably for a variety of different reasons. We had a heavy focus on our historical elements. We had very similar data around the percentage of sustained files and almost identical numbers that went to hearing, our number being that 9 factor. So in broad strokes, I can tell you that we're very comparable. Due to different police act and legislative investigative processes and oversight bodies, it's really difficult for us to make comparisons outside of Alberta. So we typically don't do that with other laws enforcement agencies, but that hopefully answers your question for kind of the most natural comparison with our partners up north.
It does, Superintendent Boyd, thank you. My second question is probably to Deputy Chief McClellan and Chief Neufeld. One of the most first pieces of information a potential complainant seeks is an officer's name and or regimental or badge number. In my experience, and you know that I have now developed a core competency in police stops and info posts and street checks and all of that, when an officer is asked for that information in an officer contact situation, the officer typically rattles off the information in a fashion that makes it fairly difficult for a potential complainant to both understand the name and the badge number or remember the information. So my understanding is that the external CPS Anti-Racism Committee has made a suggestion that would mitigate this challenge. As I understand it, they recommended that each time an officer makes a contact with a citizen, they simply provide them with a paper card that has the officer's surname and badge numbers clearly documented. Is this concept being reviewed within CPS? And if so, what is the status of the review? Are there better solutions being considered to transparently and lawfully provide an officer's information during a police contact?
Perhaps I'll start, Commissioner Campbell, and then I'll hand it over to Deputy McClellan, who, as you say, is working closely with the ARAC committee. But just going from numbers, and I don't know, Scott, if you can remember, but I know that we see every one of the formal complaints. So I don't think we get a ton of them. We definitely do get them for sure. It's our policy certainly that when asked, members will provide their name and regimental number to a citizen who wants it. I think the other thing we see a lot is folks taking pictures or video or whatever, so they often will have it. The other thing is if there's any paper that exchanges hands, and by that I mean if there's a ticket that's written or if there's an investigation of some sort or somebody's charged, it'll always be linked anyway. So I think that the team, when it comes to a complaint, actually tends to have a fairly easy time of figuring out, who was involved in the complaint. But our expectation is obviously that members would provide that and not in a flippant and sort of, quick sort of way. So I know that suggestion did come in, and I know it was discussed at the anti-racism committees, and I think Deputy McClellan might be able to give us some insight on where they got with it.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks so much, Chief, and thanks, Commissioner, for the question. I apologize. I must not have been clear when I gave my update. The card that I spoke to earlier was in fact what you're referring to, and so a great suggestion that came forward with some folks that we had the opportunity to speak to, so we've just started to have that conversation with both of our ARACs and our advisory boards. There's been one conversation, there's been a couple of questions that have been asked. So we have committed to getting back to those couple of individuals who brought that forward to us. And it's on our radar, on our table, and it's going to be on our agenda over this next month here when we meet with our other boards.
Brilliant. I'm happy to hear that, Deputy Chief McClellan. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I see Commissioner Cornett's hand up. I will note the time, 4:30. We are not doing too badly in sticking to our agenda, but I can give everybody an option of a few minutes break now or after we finish this agenda item, or we can plow on through for another while till we get through the public participation portion. So let's hear Commissioner Cornett's question, and then I'll perhaps ask for a show of hands from my colleagues on whether there's a break in the works. Go ahead, Sean.
Again, a very short reply, and I can look for information later if you like, but over half of the complaints are resolved informally. And I just wonder if you could quickly comment on how you ensure their satisfaction when they're resolved that way. Thanks.
Thank you, Commissioner Cornett. It's still a lot of work for our investigators because as you'll well know, alternative dispute resolution is equally as intense as some of the investigations. It requires an in-depth conversation, back and forth as the investigator goes back to the officer to get more information, does data polls and whatnot. And so they'll bring forward the facts around the complaint and explain police process further. So our conversations are all recorded, and there's a standard kind of sentence, if you will, that makes sure that the complainant understands this is going to go to the supervisor, or this is going to go to the commander, and they're going to have a conversation to talk about the fact that they were complained against and the fact that this behavior didn't meet our expectations. Does that sound like a level of resolution that you would be satisfied with? More often than not, 58% of the time, we hear from people saying, yes, I just need them to know that this is how I felt. This is how my experience was. And I'm satisfied knowing that that they'll be spoken to about this end. Ultimately, that gets sent away, and then we get a response back from the commander that it's taken place. And that's the trigger for us to finally connect with our citizen to say, the conversation took place, and now we're going to be able to close it. Thanks very much for your concern. I hope that helps with some level of detail.
Well, thanks very much for that response. Not seeing any follow-up from Commissioner Cornett, so I appreciate the question and the response. In looking at our agenda, think that it probably is appropriate to give just a 2 or 3 minute pause for people to refresh their waters, and I will give you that and see you back here at 4:43. Welcome back, everybody. Just give another moment. I see that some folks in the CPS room are still making their way back. Okay, I think we will start again. And thanks once again, Chief and deputies and others for all of those reports. I think we are now at the end of section 5 of our agenda and ready to move on to agenda item number 6, which is the Executive Director's report. Our Executive Director has provided a brief written report, which addresses only the continued closure of our Commission office. I am told that there is nothing that she needs to add verbally to that report. So unless there are any questions for our Executive Director, I think we can move on past that agenda item. Moving on to agenda item number 7, the representative updates. Once again, we have some written updates from our representatives on the AAPG, the CAPG, and Alberta Law Enforcement Response Team Civilian Advisory Committee. On behalf of the Police Youth Foundation, no report this month from there, having had a fulsome report last month in person from the Executive Director there. Are there any questions or any additional updates anybody would like to provide on those representations? Seeing none, then once again, I'll take the opportunity to thank everybody who does represent us in those capacities and for the reports that you've provided to us. We are now ready then to move on to item 8 on the agenda, which is the public participation session. So those who have registered with Heather are in the queue to speak. Heather will invite each of you to unmute yourselves one at a time. Once again, a quick reminder that you will have 3 minutes to speak and you should direct your comments to the chair. We will accept your comments as information only. Anyone who would like to discuss a complaint against an officer should contact our Public Complaints Director or PSS. Once again, a reminder to our media partners that we will hear from our citizens first, and then we will end the public meeting before moving on to a media scrum with the chief and myself. So Heather, are we ready now for questions?
We are ready. Thank you, Chair. Our first public participant is Amber Cannon, and I'm just going to give her a moment to queue up her line.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you and welcome.
Hi, I'm speaking today in regards to the complaints process with PSS. Specifically, I reported an officer for online on-duty sexual misconduct in 2016 to one of his coworkers, who in turn notified his superior. I'm here today to address how the Calgary Police Service addresses afterwards. I was never contacted by Internal Affairs and was not aware of an investigation that was underway until I contacted police headquarters to learn the date and time of the officer's hearing. I was never questioned, interviewed, or called once, despite the fact that I'm well known to the Calgary Police Service as having mental health and suicidal related interactions. No senior officer reached out to me. His sentence was 160-hour suspension without pay. These charges stayed on his files for 3 years. They are no longer on his Calgary Police Service record. He is still an officer. I'd like to make specific suggestions as how to proceed in the future for CPS. 1, contact the victim. 2, work with the victim to improve the service. 3, report back to the community on the progress. 4, find a way to support the victim and refer to an appropriate community service with no wait list. This officer receives support by CPS throughout the entire process. Investigations should not take place within the Calgary Police Service, but by an external body. 6, immediate dismissal of officers who are charged and found guilty, or the very least kept on their records for their entire career. The judge in this case stated that this officer took advantage of his position and that it was clearly a vulnerable citizen. 7, work with the Alberta Police Act to make changes so that there are more severe consequences for your police officers' actions. I also have 3 questions. 1, what role does the Calgary Police Commission play to help protect citizens from inappropriate behavior? 2, what specific changes will you make to address officers in the future from doing this to vulnerable citizens or any citizen? 3, how will you refer and make changes in the system for those who have been a victim of one of your officers so that they can get support? And by what date will you make these changes? I welcome your questions if you would like to hear about the stress-induced psychosis, harm, and trauma the current process has caused me.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Cannon, for attending today and for providing us your comments. As I indicated, we aren't in a position to respond to individual circumstances and to individual questions, but certainly thank you once again for providing your input to us today. And I know that you have contacts with PSS and with the Public Complaints Director as well, and invite you once again to remain in contact should you have further input that you would like to add there. Heather, could you please queue up our second public participant?
Yes, our second speaker is Margaret Mcquisten.
Good afternoon, Ms. McQuiston.
Hi there, you can hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. So thank you for this opportunity to address the commission, and thank you, Chair Croft, for your opening remarks, where you stated your commitment to Indigenous reconciliation and you honored those children who did not come home from school. It has been a challenging couple of weeks for many of us. Well, my name is Margaret Mcquisten. I'm a member of the Calgary Alliance for the Common Good, and I sit on its Truth and Reconciliation Research Action Team. As my colleague Marcia Epstein mentioned in a recent meeting of the Commission, we are trying to improve the relationship which the Calgary Police Service has with Indigenous people in this city by advocating for the CPS to resource an Indigenous liaison officer in each district. We believe that more Indigenous liaison officers will lower crime rates and save lives. Currently, there is only one such liaison officer for this entire city of 1.5 million. Before I continue, I would like to thank the Calgary Police Service for reaching out to us following the Commission's last meeting. As a result, a meeting has been scheduled for tomorrow, so that's Wednesday, July 30th at 1:30, with us and Deputy Chief Katie McClellan and Police Superintendent Asif Rashid. This is a step forward. Thank you very much. The Calgary Alliance has been advocating for more Indigenous liaison officers for over a year now. At our fall assembly in October 2020, the Calgary Police Service was in attendance and it agreed to increase the number of Indigenous liaison officers. We were elated to hear this. And after the meeting, we responded quickly when the CPS asked the Calgary Alliance to prepare a job description for what we thought should be included in the role of an Indigenous liaison officer. We did that, but not long after we were told that the CPS was not ready and that the officers would not be hired. So now we are frustrated. We have been seeking answers as to why this decision was made and are hoping to learn more at our meeting tomorrow. And I will note the remarks which the Deputy Chief made earlier in this meeting about the advice from their Indigenous Advisory Committee regarding liaison officers, and we will follow up with her more tomorrow. Something has to be done within the CPS to improve the situation. The system is broken at the expense of the lives of Indigenous Calgarians. Indigenous people in our city are over-policed and underprotected. They are dying and being incarcerated at an alarming rate. The CPS needs to urgently address this problem by developing better cultural competencies, by understanding and fixing the impacts of colonization, and by building better relationships with Indigenous communities. This is all in line with the city's commitment towards anti-racism. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls offered some solutions to this policing problem. They are laid out in Calls to Justice numbers 9.1 through 9.11. Specifically in 9.4, they call for exactly what the Alliance has been requesting: to establish a specialized Indigenous policing unit within policing services where they will lead efforts in community liaison work, community relationship building, and community crime prevention programs within and for Indigenous communities. In the job description that we provided the CPS for an Indigenous liaison unit, we focused on relationship building as a means to address the serious situation. We believe that such a unit could lead to an effective effort in anti-racism towards Indigenous people. They would do this by supporting CPS officers during their interactions with Indigenous people, by leading training within the CPS on Indigenous ways, and by advocating for Indigenous people within the CPS and creating a learning environment within the CPS on Indigenous matters. The current Indigenous liaison officer is doing some of this work and must be commended for his remarkable efforts. He has been able to build trust with those Indigenous people he encounters, but he is only one, and he is working on his own within the city with such a large Indigenous population. So in closing, I would like to ask the Commission to consider the following. Since we know that Indigenous people are over-policed and underprotected in this city, that there is a dire need for the CPS to build trust with Indigenous people to lower crime rates and save lives, that the city, including CPS, has committed to dedicating resources to anti-racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion work, as we have heard about today, and that resourcing an Indigenous liaison unit could be a significant first step in resolving this problem. So we implore the Commission to encourage the CPS to respond to the recommendation of the Indigenous Advisory Board that we heard about earlier in this meeting, and put the systems in place so that the CPS is ready to welcome Indigenous liaison officers into the service. We also ask you to continue to put pressure on the CPS to fulfill its commitment to anti-racism towards Indigenous people, and to see that any efforts to address this serious situation be implemented as soon as possible. So thank you for allowing me to share the views of the Calgary Alliance for the Common Good and for your attention to this important matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much for attending our meeting today and for providing us with your comments and your input. And on behalf of the Commission, I thank you for that input. And I'm happy to hear that you are having a meeting tomorrow, and I have no doubt that CPS will appreciate your insights and that of your organization in that meeting. And all of Commission we'll look forward to the outcome, not just of that meeting, but all of the continuing work on this very important issue that you are so dedicated to. So we look forward to the continued work of the Anti-Racism Committee, and particularly with respect to relations with Indigenous members of the citizens of this city. So I think we will move on now to our third caller, our citizen participant. Heather, can we queue up the third call?
Our third speaker today is Taylor Mcnally, and I will just queue her up to speak.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can. Welcome.
Hello, yes, Taylor Mcnally, co-founder of Inclusive Canada. Hello again. We met, I guess, about a month ago now. I usually have much prepared to speak of, and today I do not. Today I am tired. I am exhausted. Racialized people are exhausted. I really need to echo everything that Margaret just shared now. And it's sad to continue coming into these spaces, whether it be Police Act meeting, commission meetings, meetings with police one-on-one, having to say the same things over and over and over, and hearing the same excuses over and over, and the same performative actions over and over. It just continues to prove that while you claim to be working for the people, you're not listening to the people. There needs to be better ways for that to happen. There needs to be ongoing meetings, monthly town halls, something where the people can be heard, their ideas can be implemented. There are many calls to actions available to help restore relationships, to help fix many of the problems y'all are sitting here trying to figure out on your own. And it's sad, it's frustrating. You know, we are out here having to do the work ourselves. You know, the community takes care of one another. And the over policing absolutely needs to, there needs to be something that happens there. I go out on patrols with Bear Clan, and the last one we were at, you know, standing on the platform is this small unhoused woman by herself with 3 huge white police officers, all male, standing over her, trying to use some sort of intimidation tactics on her, as well as on me. Always walking by, they like to call me by name, as if we're on a first name basis to begin with. And it's just not right. And we're literally out here creating new patrol teams. We will be creating a new one to quite literally police the police on the street. And it doesn't have to be this way. The world is changing, everything is changing. We need to be working together to make those changes happen in the most safe, in the most peaceful manner, because we shouldn't have to be out here doing this, and especially not for free. the reallocation of $8 million, which ended up going back into the CPS outlets to begin with, or institutions that continue harm on Black and Indigenous people. That ain't it. It ain't it. So yeah, I'm frustrated. I'm tired. I know many echo this statement, and just do better. That's all I can say at this point, is just do better. It doesn't have to be like this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mcnally, for attending, and once again for participating with your comments. We appreciate your attendance. With that, Heather, I thought I would check to see if we have any further citizen participants who would like to speak. I believe those were all of those who had pre-registered.
That's right. We have no further speakers today.
Okay. Well, thank you very much then to everybody for attending. And once again, for all of the thoughtful comments. I will now call an end to the public portion of this meeting. Thank you for all of the commissioners for your attention. You can now step away for another break, and the chief and I will stay on for questions from the media. To all of those who are leaving us now, I look forward to seeing you again at our next meeting, which will be in September.
We're reconvening at what time?
We will reconvene. Heather, I believe our agenda calls for 5:30.
Okay.
Yes, that's right.
We'll see you then. Lori, are we ready to queue up reporters now?
Yes, we already have Adam Choi from Global queued up, so I'll just invite him to unmute.
Okay. Hello, Adam.
Yeah, hey, good afternoon. Thanks so much for taking my question. A couple of questions, one specifically about the PSS portion of the meeting today. Asking, well, anybody can answer as they see fit, but wondering, with this increase in complaints in 2020, is this a trend or is this an anomaly? And wondering what, I know that there's a number of recommendations in the report. I'm wondering how soon those recommendations are expected to be implemented within CPS.
Thanks very much for the question, Adam. I will turn that over to the room at CPS, and I will let the chief respond or direct the question to another person in the room there.
Sure, thank you. I think in terms of the question around trends, Adam, I think it's very hard to know. Virtually with all the data we're collecting in 2020, we don't really know because it was such an anomalous year. I think if we look at the end of 21, we might have some idea as to whether or not it's anomalous or whether or not those sort of differences that we see will continue on into the future. So I think it's almost early to say whether or not it's been a trend. With respect to the report and the recommendations, I'd have to look a little bit closer to talk about the timelines for the implementation. So that may be something I might encourage you to follow up with corporate communications on, just so we can get clarity on that, because I don't want to speak flippantly here to you.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Second question that I had is a bit of a news of the day question. The official opposition released information today, and I'm just trying to find it here, that the provincial government is expecting to claw back some fine revenue to the order of $10.5 million for Calgary Police in 2020, 2021. Wondering if you're aware of this report, aware of these clawbacks on fine revenue, and how you expect that to impact the budget.
Previous. Yeah, hi, Adam. If it's news of the day that is new, then it would definitely be news to us. We haven't heard anything in relation to any current decisions by the provincial government to do anything like that. But with the numbers that you give, I would suggest that actually that's been done previously, and that was in the 2020 budget that was in effect for. So I think if you do some checking, you may go back and find that that was a product of the provincial budget in 2020. And in the end, I think City Council picked up the tab for what the impact was going to be with respect to those changes around fine revenue. I don't think it's new.
If I might just follow up, then are you expecting further similar cuts in subsequent years from the provincial government in terms of fine revenue?
I would say no, that we're not anticipating anything. Certainly in our conversations with the provincial government, they haven't signaled anything in that regard. So my hope would be that there wouldn't be anything on the horizon.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Lori, who will be our next media participant?
Madeline Smith with Post Media. I'll invite her to unmute now.
Good
Hi,
afternoon.
can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, I can hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me?
I can now. Yes, you were a little low.
Interesting. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know what's going on. I'm just gonna try to be close to my computer. I guess my first question is about the increase in hate motivated crimes that have been reported this year, or the sort of high number compared to 2019. I'm wondering if anyone can tell me whether they anticipate that to continue this year, if this year looks like it will be higher than 2020, and if that is significant in terms of the larger trends that we're looking at for those types of incidents.
Thanks very much for the question. And once again, I'll turn it to the room at CPS for a response on how this year looks in terms of trends and comparatives.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question, Madeline. So I think as Deputy Chief McClellan had pointed out, it's definitely trending high for this year for us to be at the number that we're at. I think it was 81 or 83 by this time in the year. That's very high in comparison to 2019. But I think, again, we'd have to be cautious about what the trends look like going forward, because of course, 2020 was anomalous in there. And I think that one was quite low. But I think I want to look at the numbers over a little bit more time. I think we only talked about 2019, 2020, and then where we are year to date, 2021. So obviously this is very concerning for us and something we take very seriously, but I wouldn't want to make too many comments about what we expect into the future, other than to say with, we very fervently hope that it actually drops off.
Great. And my other question is just about the police conduct investigations. I see there's been a release sent out about that as well. I guess specifically, is there something you point to that resulted in some of the success that you think you saw over the past year of some of these complaints being resolved, despite I'm sure COVID impacted operations on a pretty significant level in terms of staffing and whatnot, but what do you attribute to changing the situation and in positive ways that you think have happened?
Well, I think I credit the team, Madeline, with actually doing a number of different things. So it'll be hard to know until we go out a little bit further to try to even suss out what had what impact. But I think the work around working with the complainants around informal resolution, I think is really important. As Superintendent Boyd said, that's not a process to be taken lightly. And it requires listening, and it requires understanding, and it requires making sure that the follow-up is meaningful follow-up, so that the messages get to the officer that need to get there through the supervisor. I think we've been more efficient in terms of the investigations that we conduct you know, the resources for doing these investigations aren't unlimited. I guess sometimes I give the example of, you know, going to the bar fight and you've got 35 people standing around. You could interview all 35 people about the fight, or you could interview the 5 closest that had the best view. And if it seems like, you know, the story is similar, there may not be a need to go and drain the lake and go all the way to the end. When you and especially for the purposes of an administrative investigation. So I think that can look different than these aren't homicide investigations typically. I think the other thing is we've looked hard at early case resolution where we have situations where we have an allegation against an officer. We very early go to the officer and just say, did this happen? And if it did, let's see what we can do to move it forward and get the file closed, make the difference or make the changes we need to make. And then we added some additional resources as well. So I think it's a combination of all of those things that has helped us to get some good numbers and good outcomes for 2020. I'm really pleased that we've got into some of that backlog, because that's really one of the challenges is we had a backlog in old complaints, and that makes it very, very difficult to resolve the current ones in a reasonable period of time. So I think that's something we're going to continue to focus on moving forward.
Thanks very much for those questions and for the responses. Did you have any follow-ups, Madeline?
On the informal dispute resolution, I'm a bit curious about what that looks like, and if that is considered a positive outcome. I think I just heard you say that, but does it result in, like, what is the threshold of something being too serious to be considered relevant for an informal dispute or an informal resolution, I should say?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what happens when complaints come in is we have a look at them at the front end to see what exactly is being alleged, and also if there's any history. So if we're, for instance, if the allegation, and I think Superintendent Boyd set out that quite a number of them are around lack of professionalism. So let's say if somebody goes into one of our front counters and feels the service was less than professional and they make a complaint, we would definitely offer informal resolution in a case like that, because that would seem like a really good alignment or a good place to do that. We would check though to make sure that the officer didn't have a history of those type of complaints where they had been resolved through informal resolution previously. So we have a look at that. If somebody comes in, and at times we have people come in and they may say that I was assaulted during an interaction with a police officer, but I just want to let you know. For us, an assault could be a criminal offense. That would be too serious for us, Madeline. We wouldn't resolve that informally just because of the nature of the allegations. So I think it's on a case-by-case basis when it comes in, but I think a lot of it has to do with just having a look at it and applying a lens of reasonableness. If the allegation is something that you would be comfortable resolving informally, and there's lots where there's I think the term police tactics or police practices are raised, where sometimes in conversations with the complainant, they come to learn more about why an officer might have done what they did in a situation. And just that bit of education back and forth might resolve the matter. If it's interpersonal without a history, it might be appropriate. But again, we will look at it very, very closely. And if it's not appropriate to do so, we don't do it.
Thanks.
Thanks very much for the question. If there are no further follow-ups, I will ask Lori if there are any other media participants who are queued to ask questions.
No, that's all the questions for today.
Okay. Well, thank you very much to everybody for once again participating in attending our meeting. We look forward to seeing you in September.